Well, greetings, future social workers. Welcome back to our lecture, our fourth lecture now for HIPC2. I'm excited to deliver you more tools that we're to describe, right, or to cover today to address the need to dismantle, right, oppressive systems in our society. And so that's going to be the focus of our lecture for today. So welcome back. Thank you for sticking with it, right? The end of the term is approaching, right? You can see that there's light starting to form at the end of the tunnel. So I'm excited for today's content, right? So it's going to be very practical. It's going to be something that delivers you with a lot of good ideas and tools that you can put in your belt, right? Like Batman, who has that utility belt that he carries around with him, right? So that when he finds himself in a jam, he reaches in that belt and there's some kind of fancy tool to use, right, to address the problem that's presenting itself. My goal is to equip all of you future superheroes, right, that are going out with your MSW capes to have a lot of tools in your belt to use to address systemic oppression, right, that exists in our society, right? So that's going to be the focus for today. So let's go ahead and dive into our content. We have an ambitious agenda, but my goal is to try to get through as much of this as possible with you all. Now, what I'm also going to do today is you're going to see me giving you a light overview of some of this content because we're going to discuss it more when we get together for residency. So I'm going to talk about things like group facilitation and group therapy, some of the processes to groups when you're going through groups as a social worker. I'm going to share with you some of my experiences in running groups with kiddos, young adults. And you hear me going through it as an overview. That's because as you move through your career, I just want you to hear this part. I'm going to be exposing you to the tools that we use as social workers involving empowering groups, okay, groups of people. I'm going to explain why we do that in a minute. But I also want you to understand that just because you take one semester in HIPC2 or you have a lecture on the benefits of empowering groups to change social systems, please know that this isn't going to necessarily certify you, right, as an expert in group facilitation, an expert in conflict resolution or empowerment theory or things like this. What this will do for you is this going to dip your toe into the pool of empowering groups and some of the tools that we as social workers use to do that. But as you move through your career, you're going to be equipped with certifications, trainings, things like this in order to become sharp, effective facilitators. So there are some facilitators that are social workers that facilitate team decision-making meetings or emergency decision-making meetings, emergency team meetings throughout the county. And you actually become certified in that. I'm certified in wraparound as a trainer to facilitate the wrap process, right? So when I finished grad school, I had an idea of what facilitation involved. I had some skills that I could use and I had the groundwork laid. But it wasn't until I got into my career and my agency began investing in continuing to deepen my facilitation skills that I had knowledge of what we were doing. So that's why I want you to know that some of you are like, well, are we going to dive into facilitation fully? That would be like a week-long training just in facilitation, depending on the certification that you're going for, okay? So please note, right? Again, year one, this is semester two, but when you leave this MSW program, you will have a healthy understanding of the theoretical framework and tools that we use as social workers. You will continue to build on that as you pursue licensure or build on that as you continue to do macro social work, okay? So this is a nice, firm foundation that we're building for you today. If you notice, the title for our lecture for today is The Power of Groups, Macro Social Work, and Dr. Lee Johnson and I are labeling this lecture as Tools for War, right? We want you to get excited about this because we want you to understand that just as oppressive practices and system have tools to go to war against social justice, things like bigotry, hate, discrimination, anger, poverty, right? To do that, we have tools as social workers too. Our tools are things like empowerment theory, social learning theory, hope, resiliency, right? Advocacy. And so we're going to talk about our tools that we use to dismantle oppressive systems this lecture and continue to build on some of that theoretical framework and actual tangible strategies that you're going to use, right, as a social worker. I want to remind you of that quote that I used in our last lecture from Margaret Mead, right? That said, never doubt that a group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. I agree with Margaret Mead's approach to her mentality of groups, because it's absolutely true. You never hear of one social worker in and I don't know if any of you all are comic book nerds. I am. I think I shared with some of you that I am a Marvel fan, right? I also love DC. Don't hate me on that, right? But the reality is I've been watching a lot of Marvel with my daughter, right? Because the characters are just fascinating. Anyway, here's my point. You don't hear about one superhero saving the world all the time. Superman occasionally does, right? I understand he's not Marvel, DC, but here's my point to that. When you see the Avengers rocking it together, what's happening? There's a group of people together, right, with specific skill sets that come together to save a group of individuals. Now, I want to distinguish something from social work here. One thing that you could make a parallel to the Avengers is social workers can't do it alone. Social workers alone cannot change oppressive systems and overturn them. However, a single dedicated social worker can empower a group of individuals, a group meaning a community, a county, a state, a country, right, to challenge oppressive practices. And it's through the empowerment of others, through the group mentality, that social workers can coordinate efforts to overturn, to topple oppressive systems, right? So Margaret Mead has it right when she says that a group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. What I say is it takes a social worker sometimes to get us all together moving in the same direction. I'm using this term empowerment today. You're going to hear me saying it a lot, that our responsibility as social workers is to empower. That's because empowerment has a specific definition. If you notice, I don't say that a social worker's job is to go in and save communities. I don't say that a social worker's job is to go in and tell oppressed parties how to get themselves out of trouble or how to fix the problem. I don't even say that social workers, it's their job to go in and fix everything on their own, right? I'm saying that our role as social workers is to empower the individuals that we are working with. Let's examine this definition of empower. Empowerment then is this process of increasing personal, interpersonal, okay, or political power so that individuals, families, and communities can take action to improve their situations. Let me say that again. So individuals, families, and communities can take action to improve their situations. Do you see the difference here? As social workers, we don't enter with a mentality of a savior mentality, right? Where we come in and say, wow, things are really bad. Let me tell you how to fix your systemic oppression. Right? Wow, things are really bad. Let me come in, step in and fix things for you, become the savior. Everyone praise me. Thank you so much for coming in, social worker. And then I step out once I have my flowers and my gifts and all of that, right? That's not a social worker's role. Empowerment then, right? Work on three levels. Really, for empowerment to take place as a social worker, we're working in three levels. We're working with the individual, the power within. This is the micro aspect of social work, the collective group, the power with, right? Which could be considered the meso group. And then the social, okay, the power in relation to certain ends, right? And power against certain social forces. That's the macro. Okay, so what we're doing is we're addressing, though, that all of these layers, right, the three layers of the power within, right, the power with, and the power in relation to certain ends, they're not separate from one another. In social work, all of these are working in tandem. Think of it this way, right? When we're on a plane, well, long before the days of COVID, right? When we were on a plane and we were traveling somewhere, that the flight attendants working the flight, before they would give the safety spiel, right? And one of the things that they would do is they would share about the mask that drops from the ceiling, right, in case of an emergency. And what do they always tell us, right, when we're sitting on the plane? You put on your mask first before you help anyone else, right? And so what we're learning is when we step in and are working with groups who have been historically oppressed or marginalized, if they are still battling their own demons, their own oppression, their own internalized oppression, feeling of self-doubt, inadequacy, then individuals aren't ready yet to go out and then teach others how to be empowered persistent, persevere, whatever the case is. So what's important to understand is that we need to work on the individual to empower the individual so that they in turn can empower others. This is the exciting part about social work, is when you can step into a community and not only see growth individually within your relationships with individual people, but seeing growth as a group coming into their own to advocate, right, for justice collectively as a community. So this is the notion of empowerment. So when we talk about empowerment in this way, what we're talking about is empowerment theory. Empowerment theory, okay? Another theoretical framework to throw at you that's important for us to know as social workers. There are two concepts to empowerment theory. One is social justice, and the other is this consciousness, this critical consciousness, this raising of our awareness. So social justice, as we know, is this right to protect and to advocate for identical protection, opportunities, obligations, and social benefits for all individuals, not just those in power in our community. We're all pretty familiar with this notion of social justice at this point, due to other classes like Marge Pops and some of what we discussed earlier in this semester in HPSI 2. But we also want to focus on, when we're talking about empowerment theory, consciousness, raising, particularly sometimes what you may refer to as critical consciousness, this ability to be woke, as we might describe, right, in society in modern language, of enhancing people's awareness of themselves and of others, or the issues in their social environment. Folks, part of what we're doing collectively in HPSI 2 and in your time in the MSW program, part of faculty's responsibility, our job is to raise your consciousness, to have an understanding of oppressive systems, how they are formed, how that storm cloud is formed. And when the oppression rains down on the individual, then we talk about at the micro level, how do we care for the individual, right, that's got the sniffles and cough and all of these sort of things associated with the systemic oppression, that storm that has hit them. Right. So part of what we're doing is, when we talk about things like the distribution of wealth and power, when we talk about social problems such as institutionalized racism, what we're doing is we're talking about raising your collective consciousness around these issues so that you are in turn educated and empowered, right, to go out and educate others and empower others to topple over these oppressive systems. So here's some key concepts related to empowerment theory that might be important, are important for us to know, right? Mutual aid. People can help and empower each other through the act of providing support, feedback, and information. This is important to understand. As you read in Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, right? Freire talked distinctively about the banking model, and he talked about oppressive education, the notion of seeing individuals, our students as professors, as these empty vessels that don't bring any knowledge with them into their courses. That's a false way, an oppressive way of looking at education, right? What we want to take from that as social workers, and we go in, we have to understand that we've gone to school, we've read some books, we've watched Dr. Mexico's lectures, right? But that doesn't mean that we know it all. We're not omnipotent, right? We're not a crystal ball. We have learned a few things, but we also need to understand and be humble enough to recognize that, we're going to talk about this in a second here, is that we are humble enough to know that we can learn from the community that we are serving, even when that community has been oppressed. In fact, I would argue we have more to learn from that community as a result of that. Power is another key concept to empowerment theory. Imagine that, right? That the ability to move people on a chosen course to produce an effective or achieve some goal. Let me say this, right? Most of the time in dominant groups, people that hold the power are the ones that are able to make changes in society, even when people don't want to see the changes happen, right? So when people that hold power in dominant groups, what we call the hegemony of society, those that hold the power, those dominant groups, are able to oppress others because they have the ability to move folks along in their agenda, even when they oppose it. Our job as social workers is to shift that power differential and put the power back into the hands of everyone collectively, in order to honor the dignity, the respect, and the humanity of each other, not just one group of individuals. And finally, multicultural socialization is this strive to really seek to identify, to be sensitive, to have a sensitivity to, and to appreciate the differences that might exist among members in terms of ethnicity, race, gender, things like sexual orientation, right? All of those personal attributes that we have, right? And that's why we took marginalized populations to begin with, to understand first and establish that we are all human beings. We all deserve to be treated with respect and dignity as a result of that. And it's up to us to blend empowerment, right, of our groups to recognize that we need to treat each other with that same respect and dignity. Right? So as social workers in your textbooks, you're going to read a lot about the ecological perspective or the ecosystem perspective. And we're going to talk about this just very briefly here. And then I'm going to give you some practical examples, of course, like I always bring you, right, of content, how to relate this to everyday life. So what's mainly important to understand, and let me go into this here, this might help as more of a visual aid, okay? And you can always go back to this slide here if you would like to read the nuances, but I'm going to kind of give you an overview of that. The ecological perspective in social work basically refers to the understanding that the individual is part of a complex network of systems, that the individual doesn't operate in a silo, that it's not just all about us all the time, right? Sometimes in our society, we tend to take this hyper individualized perspective where we believe that the world revolves around us. The ecological perspective would call for us to recognize that we are an individual that is part of a network, right? Of friends, family, things like that. And that as friends and family, we go off to school and we work with social institutions and we renew our card with the DMV, our driver's license, which is part of an organization or a social institution. Our children go off to school every single day. We go to a healthcare agency when we're not feeling well, and we interact with systems beyond our immediate selves and our family. And when we have a lot of immediate selves, us and families living together in one common place, well, that forms a community. And how we act as a community, we are impacted by individually, and us as a turn impact our community. Think about it this way. If enough folks in your community decided we're not going to stop for red lights, what is the problem that you're going to have as a community? You're going to have maybe a high morbidity rate of car accidents, people passing from car accidents. You might have increased insurance claims from agencies saying, oh, you live in that zip code. There's a lot of car accidents in that zip code. Therefore, if you are going to park your car and live in that zip code, we're going to charge you more money for doing so, right? You may have increased rates of anxiety and substance abuse in living in that community because you're always worried and freaked out if every time you get in your car, one of your community members doesn't want to stop that day and you get run down, right? And so what happens then? Public policy steps in, someone at the national, state, or local law comes in and says, what is going on in that community? We don't like what we're seeing. And you know what? We're going to make a new policy. No one in that community can drive a car. You all don't want to stop for red lights. So maybe you'll learn to stop and a little more safely on a bicycle, right? Or a skateboard or whatever the case is, but we're not giving you cars anymore. So you see how an ecological perspective, in a very simplified example, of course, albeit, right, is a complex network of the individual existing, shaping, and being shaped by their environment, right, as part of a collective group. And all of this is happening around us on a daily basis within multiple systems that we interact with. So the ecological perspective, I know I just gave you a ton of information there, right? Let's break it down into little bites. The ecological perspective views people not as passive reactors to their environment, but rather dynamic and reciprocal interactors with their environment. Sometimes we're like that officer, that sergeant, right, in battle that you see in movie scenes, where as a social worker, we're going through the community and we're asking people, do you like what's happening with this policy? Do you think this is just? And when you talk to people, you discover that a lot of people say, we don't like this policy. This is unjust. This is wrong. And we ask them, you know, have you done anything about this? And they may say no. And some may say no because it's not my job to step in, or no, it's not my concern. It doesn't impact me. Other people may say no, I want to, but I simply don't know how. I don't know how to take action. Well, at that point, it's our job as social workers to rally folks off the sidelines and say, if you don't like what's going on in society, you are not passive. You can change things, right? You can change things for the better, but you need to get involved. You are not passive in your environment. And so what happens is an ecological model really tries to improve coping patterns so that a better match can be attained between individuals' needs and the characteristics of their environment. And so what will happen is that if folks are, and this is one thing we're addressing, right, with as you're reading in your textbook on toxic inequality, right, is that individuals who live in low opportunity areas are therefore saying, you know what, we have needs too. I want my child to go to college. I'm sending them to school every day, but they're not giving the best education because our school is short of resources or short of teacher power, right? Or short of this, and this, daycare, right? Transportation, all of these things, language needs. And as a result of that, though, a social worker comes in and says, let's look at the impact this systemic issue of a lack of resources in our education system for our community is creating for individuals being able to move right up the chain of social mobility later in life. And let's talk about all the pieces. Remember, we're talking about a macro pieces. We don't just look at one piece of the puzzle. We build these pieces together to say, how does race, how does economics, how does gender, how does citizenship status all play into what is occurring in this little town, right? Impacting a child's ability to go to college, right? And so the ecological perspective, basically, I'm not going to read all this to you, but I just want you to understand that you're going to hear me using this language a lot, right? Focuses on interrelational transactions. So remember when I talked about the social exchange theory, similar to that, transactions between systems and stress that all existing elements within an ecosystem play an equal part in, right? And so how is it? And you'll hear mayors talking about this in cities, right? Mayors talking about how is it that we can have the best experience possible for citizens in our proud city of ... You insert your favorite city there, right? So that when folks in our city are visiting and they want to get around and see the sites, we have a public transportation system that matches their needs. But not only that, so that citizens who are trying to get to work every day can find meaningful work within our proud city, can get to work on a daily basis because we have fantastic public transportation. Do not have to worry about disproportionality of arrest rates or policing, right? Depending on where they live, whatever the case is. And what you're seeing is what that mayor is talking about is the ecological perspective of seeing how all the systems in that city of your choice play together in creating an environment, right, that is hospitable to live in, enjoyable to live in for all individuals, not just one group. And so over the course of your career, right, and thank you for hanging in with me here. Don't worry, I'm getting to some other content soon here. Ultimately, in your career, you're going to be doing a lot of what we call community organizing and social service work. Some people say, well, community organizing, isn't that just for unions? Social service work, isn't that just for child protective services? Well, no, this is referring to a broader social term to address social work, okay, and social workers in our community. So when we talk about community organization in a broad term, outside of just one agency, what we're talking about is a social intervention which seeks to maximize the ability of disadvantaged people to influence their environment by developing power to do things like a community acquiring their own resources, changing inadequate institutions and laws on their own, building new laws and policies, and being more responsive to their needs of those of all human beings. So if you notice here, it doesn't say that community organizing is a social worker coming in and telling a community what they've done wrong and how they can fix it by listening to you, right? A community organizer, effective community organizer as a social worker, comes in and creates conditions to develop that power within a community. Once that power is developed and that community is able to assert their voice, right, to create change, meaningful, just change in their community, the social worker's time is to work our way out of a job, right, and step away from that process. So it's important to understand there's types of groups that you're going to be working with as social workers. There's primary groups, there's secondary groups. Primary groups are that small group that interact over a relatively long period of time. They stay around. We call those longitudinal, okay? And then what happens is a secondary group is where a group in which interaction is impersonal and temporary in nature, often casual and limited impersonal involvement, tend to be organized around specific goals. As social workers, you'll be working within primary and secondary groups. There's going to be times where you go in and you're sticking with a client or a community for years or a long period of months, maybe leading up to a year. There's going to be times where you're working with individuals in limited doses in settings of service delivery that have already been planned out. Some modalities of therapy, some types of social work contracts actually limit the amount of time that you spend in sessions or in groups working with clients. And so it's important to understand you'll be working within different groups. Now, here's what's important to understand. I'm going to step away from the technical. Remember, I often say social work is a balance of the head and the heart. I'm going to step away from the head component here of the technical piece in a second, and we're going to move into understanding the heart of what it looks like to actually work with groups that have been oppressed or are oppressing others on a daily basis, right? So how do we get out of this notion of violence and trauma, this cycle, right? We have social problems that exist where people are getting hurt on a daily basis. Right? We go back and you consider some of the emotional evoking material that we've examined, some of the statistics around distribution of wealth and power. We've read the names of those who have been killed at the hands of institutionalized racism in our country. And we're saying, how do we break this cycle? How do we fix this? When so many people are hurt and their families are hurt, those people's hearts can get hardened and calloused, and they can become angry and act out on others as a result, right? If you remember back to my Marge Pops class, I threw out a term that I hope you remember. And it's this term here that says, hurt people, hurt people. Hurt people, hurt people. Now, I asked you to consider that one of our jobs as social workers, and I said this specifically in our first class in Marge Pops, it's okay if you don't remember, that's why I'm saying it now, right? Is that our job as social workers not only to help those who have been hurt, but as well as those who have done the hurting. I'd like you to take a minute to look at the pictures here. Let me move my face out of the way to take a look at some of the pictures on the screen, these two pictures. You may see these people and look at these individuals as angry people, oppressive people, because they are talking about protests going on with supporting a white nationalist or white supremacist viewpoint. This here, right here, is a group called the Proud Boys, a white supremacist group that is known for also being highly aggressive and antagonistic, and is exercising their political rights, right, to protest, to demonstrate with firearms, all right? So they are blending their perspective of white supremacy with their Second Amendment right to bear arms. Here, if you look at this screen on the top, we have what going on? We have a protest, a collision of two groups coming together. This is a diversity makes a stronger march within the community. And what we have are individuals that are protesting against white supremacy with a literal collision of individuals who are white supremacists colliding with this group, a combination of those who have been hurt, as well as those who are doing the hurting, right? As a social worker, we're looking at this, and I said that our obligation in that first class is that we need to work with both. How do we do that? How do we do that when many of you are saying, I hope all of you are saying, right? Otherwise, we're in the wrong degree here, folks. But if you're saying, I don't stand with this, this is not what I'm about. I'm not about white supremacy. I'm not about marginalizing others, right? If you stand against this, yet you're called to serve a white supremacist, how do you understand where that individual is coming from? Well, I'd like to take a look at that for a second. I'd also like to point out one thing. I'm going to show you a second image after this, a second video, which provides an image of this blending of views and around the Second Amendment. Now, we're not going to go too far into the discussion of the Second Amendment in this course. We can talk about that in others. But the standard that we're seeing here is when individuals who carry a white supremacist view choose to exercise their view also backed by a firearm, they say that they're protecting their rights Second Amendment rights and their voice to protest, right? But what happens when a group that's historically marginalized and oppressed based on their skin tone does the same thing? Anyway, let's look at this first clip. I'd like us to examine this notion of white supremacy and where that comes from, because we have to be ready to serve those who have been hurt as well as those who have done the hurting. And I think one of the things that you're going to find is that individuals, right, who have done the hurting have also been hurt many times on their own. So let's examine this short film. This is about 3 minutes here.
Hundreds of white nationalists storming the University of Virginia.
In a car plowing into a crowd of demonstrators protesting against those white nationalists. A 32-year-old woman killed.
When you look at white supremacist groups, a lot of what they do in terms of recruitment is kind of like what you might call a soft sell, kind of reel the person in. It's almost like, getting fish on the hook. Then you start to ratchet up the language in terms of intensity and extremism. The idea of illegal immigration has been a wedge issue that white supremacist groups have used for a long time. This government is being overtaken by people from the outside, and so it's really this kind of more of an insider-outsider issue, and eventually they can pull a person along to see this as a racialized issue, that essentially whites are on the verge of extinction, they're a minority in their own country, they see the US as a white country. There's kind of a misnomer or kind of folklore or stereotype about white supremacists tending to be people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people who are less educated, redneck with a gun rack on their pickup truck type thing, There's also folks who are involved in white supremacist groups that are highly educated, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and so forth, people that come from middle class backgrounds, that come from upper class backgrounds. So you do really get a wide cross section of folks who get involved in white supremacist groups, and this is really important to underscore because it shows that these groups have a much broader kind of recruitment potential than folks often recognize. One of the things that we find is that individuals often have backgrounds where they've experienced substantial trauma before they ever come in contact with white supremacist groups. The white supremacist group, though, gives them an ideology. It gives them an outlet for their feelings of frustration and aggression that stem from this unresolved trauma. The ideology gives them targets about where they should direct their aggression and violence towards. The worst thing we can do is shut down dialogue. So even obviously dialogue that we don't necessarily agree with, or that we find dangerous in some ways. We have to find a way to allow for different kinds of dialogue to occur. And if we start picking and choosing the kinds of dialogues that we like or that affirm our beliefs, then that multicultural aspect of society does become very adversarial. And it becomes hard to have a more kind of congenial multicultural society if we're only going to support points of view that kind of affirm our own.
Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to share this tidbit is that one thing that was reinforced in this video was that we all don't examine. Sometimes remember I shared with you that binary approach to examining racism, when we think we equate that this is what racism looks like in our country. And this is one image of it, but it's not the only image. Racism is more complex than that in our country. The professor at Chapman that was sharing his perspective on this also shared that we need to understand that this is not the only representation of racism that exists in our country. There are individuals that are educated, well-to-do, well-spoken, that share these views of a white supremacy ideology. What's also important to consider, and this is our major takeaway that I'd like for you to take from this short clip here, is that the lines of dialogue need to remain open. The worst thing that we could do as social workers, especially as role models, because remember, social learning theory, okay, is a part of role modeling behavior, is to shut down dialogue between both sides. Now, if you notice, he said shut down dialogue. He didn't say arguing, right? This clash, there's little opportunity for dialogue in here for anyone to listen. Everyone's speaking, saying you're wrong, and the other one's saying you're wrong, or one saying we're right, and the other one's saying we are right. No one is dialoguing in this situation. These individuals here are not interested in dialoguing. They're interested in establishing dominance dominance through intimidation, right? And saying, here's who we are, and this is how we enforce our ideology if you push us, right? And so this is the danger that we walk in social work. If we are social workers that say we will never work with a white supremacist, we will never work with someone who has been hurt and who has also done the hurting, we are perpetuating this system, this larger system of racism, of oppression in our country. Now, I showed you one clip here of what happens when individuals with a white supremacist ideology choose to also exercise their Second Amendment right. And some individuals will say, when they look at this and say, well, you know what, that's just them exercising their right. Well, maybe they're white supremacists, but they're not actively shooting anyone at the moment. And it's their right, their Second Amendment right, to carry a weapon. It's their right that was given to them in the Constitution. Hey, I don't agree, but maybe we just got to let this go. There were reactions that occurred in the summer when another group of individuals chose to conduct a march on Stone Mountain. Now, Stone Mountain, it's going to be explained in the film, so I won't spend a lot of time explaining it, but a historic stronghold, okay, stronghold for white supremacist groups, including the KKK. Now, an individual of Black armed citizens chose to do a march to Stone Mountain, okay, protesting individuals that were advocating for, they weren't protesting against it, but individuals were advocating to preserve a white supremacist monument that was there. They wanted to keep it. Now, the individuals that were marching on Stone Mountain that were armed here, that you see in the picture, are saying, no, it needs to come down. But what was also happening was there were some threats going around on social media this time, individuals saying that if there was a sample of resistance that showed up a party, that white supremacist groups are saying we will defend the monument. And so in response to that, this group came out and marched on Stone Mountain. I'm going to show you this film clip here very briefly because it's really significant and important to understand the reaction, the public reaction that we saw to this very incident. Even when one group is choosing to back their Second Amendment right that shares a white supremacy ideology, and another group here simply based on their appearance, the threat that comes forward as a result of that. So let's watch this video. This is 1 minute and 52 seconds.
Black power.
Oh my gosh.
Sit around. Look at what the you did. You made blacks come out. I don't see no white militia. So to the boogie boys, the 3%ers, and all the rest of you scared ass rednecks, we here. Where the you at? We in your house. Let's go. NFAC, mother. NFAC.
Okay, so just another visual image there to share, right, to broaden our perspective on what has been going on in this country regarding this notion of free speech, regarding this notion of where individuals are polarized in this country. Here, many people had a reaction when they watched this take place and they said, this is individuals exercising their right, First Amendment right to gather, right? But second, they combine that with the notion of their Second Amendment right to carry firearms. Both groups did that, but both groups did not get the same reaction. In fact, there was a wave of fear that went through the community when Black citizens chose to march, even though we had white supremacists marching at the same time or similar times, not exactly the same day around this issue, both exercising their First Amendment and Second Amendment rights, this polarized group. The point of it is, though, is that as you're working to empower groups in the community to establish a voice, what is the voice that we are giving them? What are we emphasizing, and how are we choosing to equip individuals to express their voice? My concern for both sides in this issue is that, again, no dialogue can take place when I'm staring at a barrel magazine of fully auto ammunition, when I'm looking down the barrel of an AR-15 backed by the image of a white supremacy group. Dialogue is not taking place here. And as a result of that, what we see are individuals that are experiencing trauma at traumatic rates throughout their lifespan, children growing up watching this take place, and individuals living through this moments that, as we've seen through the Average Childhood Experiences Study, or ACEs, has detrimental effects on our health and well-being later on as adults. In fact, what we know through the research, not only by Dr. Nadine Dixon, but by others that she referenced in her book, The Deepest Well, that other things that we've learned from this is trauma has a huge impact on our epigenetics, on our ability to cope with stressors in life. And as a result, we adopt healthy risk behaviors and are more susceptible, if we've been exposed to trauma at a young age and even into adulthood, of developing chronic diseases, disabilities, and social problems, and even early morbidity rates as a result of the trauma that we experience. So we have to recognize that not only we are obligated as social workers to address macro issues, social problems like the distribution of wealth and power, like institutionalized racism, genderism, and all of these other isms, not only because it is not healthy for a society in terms of its interactions, its resources, its distribution of opportunities, but it's also literally unhealthy for individuals. It's a toxic environment that we create for individuals growing up in a society where social problems reign unchecked, And so it's important to understand that social work group practice then is goal directed. When we step into a community where all of this tension is taking place, we have to understand it equates to trauma. And as a result, we need to achieve a goal, a common goal from that community, where we work to obtain that goal by recruiting individuals, of all sides to come together in dialogue, so to hear one another's perspective and learn. How do we do that? Well, I'm going to share with you a number of committees that I want to share with you, and how these are the actual tools you can use in order to do that. So I want to share with you, one is forming a vigilant committee. Okay, the Vigilant Committee of Philadelphia, for example, was operated between 1837 and 1852, and it was the secret auxiliary of the Vigilant Association. The Vigilant Association was a group formed by the ardent abolitionist Robert Purvis, an abolitionist. And so what happened was, he wanted to publicly promote anti-slavery ideology to create a fund to aid colored persons in distress, is what it was described as. And this Vigilant Committee's purpose was to appoint offices, raise revenue, and have resources readily available to assist runaway slaves while they stayed and passed through Philadelphia. Now, here's what's important to understand. This is one individual that said, I can't stand by, Robert Purvis, and said, I can't allow this process to continue, but what can I do? Well, he recognized that there are still slaves that were on the trail trying to make their way up north to Canada. Well, what do those slaves on the run need? They need shelter, they need resources, they need advocacy. In some cases, they need food on their backs, clothes, whatever the case is. Said, who is willing to contribute to this? This is a notion of community empowerment, Not only to empower the community to stand up in opposition against the practice of slavery, but to support individuals who were seeking their freedom, And so definitions of the description of like a social work group, for example, is this could be a social work group here, right? But it's important to understand that social work is this broad professional practice that refers to the giving of help or the accomplishment of tasks in a group setting. That's why we call it social, and then we call it work because it's hard to do. This work of gathering a community to speak bravely to an issue of slavery, to do it under the radar and support the continued escape, right, of slaves from the South moving their way to Canada was social work. It involved a group of individuals all pushing against a system that they could have been responsible, held legally responsible for, in jailed, imprisoned, fined, and even killed for aiding slaves on the run in defiance of the social problem of institutional racism, okay? Let me move through this then really quickly because I also want to pay close attention to our time. I want to introduce you to systems theory in particular, right? And so systems theory represents this notion of group work representing or understanding that groups work within multiple systems in our society. These systems don't always align and they have competing priorities at times, right? The needs of the incarceration system, of the justice system, are different from the needs of the education system. The policies within the two don't always align. You're going to find that out very quickly in a practical sense as a social worker when you step out into a school system for the first time. And now you are learning school acronyms, you're learning the policies and procedures as explained to you by an assistant principal or principal about what you can or cannot do while you're on the school sites. And so the piece to this to understand is that when you're working within a group, you want to really shoot for 4 objectives, okay? And this is aligned with systems theory, is that there's integration, means by which groups fit together and work together. There's going to be natural points of alignment at times working with multiple systems, but there's also going to be multiple points of friction or conflict too, which is normal. Pattern maintenance means by which the group adheres to basic processes and procedures. So what's important to understand is whether you're a CPS worker or you're working at a school, you understand some things like privacy is important. You're not going to go around advertising the names of all the kiddos in the school or a client that you're serving because you understand that there are basic processes and procedures to confidentiality that take place when you're working with children. Okay, goal attainment, for example, achievement of the ultimate tasks and goals. And so what's going to happen is that if you're a social worker going in, your primary concern is for safety and stability or safety and supervision in the home of the child that is your client. You also want to understand that the school is about safety, but they're also concerned with academic performance. So how do you set goals for that kiddo to address not only the safety and the supervision of the child, but also that they're pursuing their education and succeeding in the school environment? So setting those goals based on the systems you're working in is important. And finally, adaptation, right? The ability to be able to pivot quickly. Now, this can be difficult when you're working with large systems like a public education system, child welfare, the court system, right? Where those systems are not usually equipped to pivot quickly. So where can you be creative within the systems you're working with according to systems theory? Okay. Let's move through these types of groups then, right? So when you're working with groups, some of you think of group work as social workers, and you may go right to group therapy, okay? That's one way of a type of group that exists as a social worker. But another way to consider groups is very different, and that's through the outside the clinical lens, applying the macro lens of group work that exists in social work. So groups could be therapeutic and you could be doing group therapy. I'm going to talk about some of the stages of working with groups, whether it's therapeutic or not, that you will find as a social worker that I've experienced in running groups as a social worker. But then you can also run groups outside of the clinical context, okay? So here's what's important to understand. If you are not going for licensure as a social worker, that doesn't mean that you're free of running groups. You may find yourself doing group work. In fact, you will find yourself doing group work as a social worker. If some of you are working with children and families, you're going to be leading a group of children and families together to meet their goals. If you're working in wraparound, you're going to do that. If you're part of a treatment team, even if you're a non-licensed social worker, you'll be working with a treatment team to develop a plan with that client, okay, on how to work through some of the challenges that they're experiencing. So one type of group that you may have in social work is a task group, a collection of people that apply the principles of group dynamics to solve problems, develop innovative ideas, formulate plans, right? This does not have to involve a clinical diagnosis. You're doing things within the community that need assistance. There are different types of task groups in social work. You can have teams that are client-based, treatment conferences, right? That clinical social work mentality. You can have staff development groups, administrative groups, committees, boards of directors, delegated counselors, and social action groups. For the sake of time, I'm only going to describe a couple of these to you because you will read about more of these in your text. We're only going to highlight a couple today. I'd like to talk about, and actually let's do this because I know that I'm watching the time here. I want to talk about, and let me move through here. One, let's talk about the board of directors, okay? I want to point this out because it's really important to understand. And then we'll address this picture in a second. I know some of you are like, is Dr. Baker going somewhere with that picture? Many of you have heard of agencies, both public and nonprofit, right, and private nonprofit, having boards of directors, right? And a board of directors is an essential part of any organization because this administrative group is composed of individuals who formulate the organization's mission, objectives, and policies, in addition to overseeing the organizations and ongoing activities of an entire agency. And ultimately, some board of directors groups have ultimate control over the agency's higher administration, including CEOs, executive directors, and such. They are at the helm steering policy, all right, for an entire agency. This is important to understand. So I sit on a couple of board of directors groups. I'm a member of a board of directors for a couple of agencies that are local to us in the Inland Empire. When you see this picture, some of you are probably noticing the lack of diversity, not only in race and ethnicity, but also in gender when you're looking at these roles, right? You're looking at this picture and saying, is that what a board of directors looks like? To be quite honest with you, that is not outside the norm, right, in society of what a board of directors looks like. The fact that I sit on a couple of boards myself is unique in the fact that I am a person of color and that I come with experience and I'm not in the upper percentile, right, of an income bracket. What's important to understand is there's enormous power behind the board of directors. If your board of directors only carries one perspective or one interest to the table, then guess what? Your agency is only going to carry one perspective or one primary interest to the table in its decision making. And the reason for that is because board of directors carry immense authority at times with them. They're able to serve as ambassadors to communicate the organization's missions and policies. So part of what I do on the board of directors is I show up to events in the community and I talk about the wonderful things that our agency is doing. I bring awareness to it. We also interpret and communicate to the organization the needs of the community. If I'm out of the loop with the social problems that are existing, if I don't see racism, inequality, the distribution of wealth and power as a problem within our society, then I'm not going to advocate for our agency to do anything about it, right? So you can see where if there are blind spots, the agency then carries those same blind spots as the board of directors. They define the organization's position on public policies and serve as advocates, right? Think about then during the summer of unrest, how many board of directors said we should not make a statement that Black Lives Matter. We're going to lose dollars. People are going to be in opposition. Our clients won't like that, right? An entire organization fails to recognize the needs of a community because a small group of individuals said, I don't think this is a good idea. To protect the organization from inappropriate intrusions by government and special interest groups, right? So part of the reason why agencies may want board of directors like myself involved because I've also sat in state audits, right? I've had individuals coming into auditing our chart with a possibility of recruitment. I understand the financial aspect of that and the hit that it can cause an agency if we are not well protected against audit. So I may want to ask to see what are the policies and steps in place to shelter individuals, right, from unnecessary recruitment of funds based on audits, to promote the organization to financial donors and potential donors. So here's another piece. Some board of directors may choose to be participate or be asked to participate on a board of directors because they're uniquely positioned through their network of supports to draw funding into an organization, right? So these are all immense power distributions that exist. Now, another form of group that you can use as a social worker to combat oppression, in addition to the board of directors, is also social action groups. I promise you, I'm going to make a really practical example of this in a second here. So social action groups get a lot of attention because they carry some big names around them. Social action groups in particular can be really well known based throughout history. And sometimes if we don't understand the origin or the function of those groups as they were designed, we can get some really interesting ideas around the purpose of social action groups. But a social action group, really what it's doing is attempting to shift power and resources in order to modify or improve macro social issues, right? I'm going to give you an example of the Black Panther Party as a social action group, okay? Now, a social action group really seeks to do these 5 things here to increase understanding of a social problem, to inspire others to take action, to raise consciousness of a group about a social problem that's taking place, okay, to provide mutual support, all right, to groups who are in need of it as a result of that social problem, and to use cooperation to change things. Now, some of you are saying, Dr. Mako, I thought that the social or the Black Panther Party was a social action group that was militant, that was dangerous, that wanted to overthrow. That's usually a common misconception of the Black Panther Party. I would like to take a minute, and I think it's just a 5-minute video, to examine, right, social action through the lens of what the Black Panther Party was actually designed to do. Right, so this is just a brief history, a total of 5 minutes.
One of the most well-known civil rights organizations of the late 1960s was the Black Panther Party. Who started the Black Panther Party? What did the group advocate? In many northern and western cities in the United States, African Americans were living in urban ghettos with high unemployment rates and substandard housing. Many also believed that they were treated unfairly and in some cases even brutalized by police forces which did not represent them. For example, Oakland, California had 661 police officers, yet only 16 of those were African American. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale had been involved in many different civil rights organizations in their young lives, including those who promoted the Black Power ideology. However, they were frustrated with the failure of these organizations to combat police brutality and other injustices they saw in their communities. In October of 1966, the two men formed the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, later simply known as the Black Panther Party. They organized armed patrols that would follow police officers, monitoring them for incidents of abuse. If the police attempted to confront them, Black Panther members would recite the state and federal laws which permitted them to carry their loaded weapons. The Black Panther Party first gained national attention after an incident in 1967. The group carried loaded firearms into the California State Assembly in protest of a piece of legislation which would make carrying loaded firearms illegal. 6 of the members were arrested for this incident. In May of 1967, the Black Panther Party issued a list of 10 points which stated their beliefs and values. This list included things such as full employment, decent housing, and an end to police brutality. They also sought education for African Americans and justice within the court system. The group's ideals resonated within the Black community, and their numbers expanded rapidly. By 1968, the Black Panther Party had a presence in more than 20 major American cities, including New York City, Chicago, Boston, Dallas, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. Some estimates claim that their membership numbers were as high as 10,000 at its peak in 1969. The party also boasted an influential newspaper which was read by more than 250,000 people. Its editor was Eldridge Cleaver, and he became a persuasive voice within the Black Power movement. Cleaver would eventually become the third most prominent member of the Black Panther Party, behind Newton and Seal. The Black Panther Party also started community-friendly programs, such as the Free Breakfast for Children program. They believed that they could provide for the needs of those in poverty better than the government could. It has been estimated that the Black Panther Party fed more than 20,000 children through this program during the 1968 and 1969 school year. The organization offered other services as well, including clothes distribution, classes on politics and economics, free medical care, and lessons on self-defense and first aid. They also set up an ambulance program and drug rehabilitation services. However, the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not agree with many of the organization's paramilitary activities, such as carrying loaded guns. The FBI regarded them as a black nationalist hate group, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover even referred to them as the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. The group was targeted for investigation with the intent of weakening the group's power and damaging their credibility. The Black Panther Party continued to exist as an organization throughout the 1970s, but never regained the prestige they had once enjoyed. Over the course of that decade, their numbers dwindled away until, by 1980, only 27 people were still official members of the Black Panther Party.
Okay, so I wanted to provide you with this example because I think it's important to note that sometimes what starts out as a social action group, in this case, when we're uneducated in the foundation of this group, when we allow some of that social bias, that implicit and explicit bias to take place, we miss the boat in what a group is intended to do. Black Panther Party in particular was really given a rap later on as being this militant group, this far out group, that the nation's greatest threat. But you heard that the numbers itself, we're talking about as a group, 10,000 people, 10,000 individuals in an entire country, and yet they were met at the greatest opposition from the federal government, right? The highest law enforcement agency in the land. Why? Why? So consider then here, the individuals shown in this picture, in this what seems to be this dominant, threatening picture, are exercising their state and federal rights to carry a firearm. These were the rights given and protected by the Constitution. When people of color choose to enact this same right that's given in the Constitution, they're labeled as a nationalist hate group. But when people of not of color choose to enact in the same photo, we call them patriots. Right? When individuals choose to take it upon themselves to feed their own, to clothe their own, because the government is not providing food and clothing for individuals, they're seen as an out there group, right? A far extreme group. Yet all they're doing is saying that we want to be treated with the same rights because we are citizens of this country, and we are being treated as second-class citizens. They're saying we have a right to be safe in our own communities. No one's running around chasing or shooting police, but we have a right to make sure that you are policing the way that you are given within the checks and balances of your power. We have a legal right to carry firearms, and all we're doing is making sure that you're doing your job according to the letter of the law, right? But this group, this social action group, because it was a group of historically marginalized individuals exercising rights within their protected citizenship status of the Constitution of the United States, that was threatening to individuals. It was scary to individuals in power, particularly even to J. Edgar Hoover, who decided to try to dismantle this group and take away the breath, right, from this movement. Now, I have a clip prepared for you here, but due to time, and I'm watching this closely, I want to make sure that you all get out at a decent time. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to actually post this clip for you on Blackboard so you can learn more about the Latino or Latinx organizing and activism movement, particularly led by Cesar Chavez, okay? And so what I want to be able to do is provide you with this information here. This is another example of a social action group that assembled to advocate for the well-being just wages, just working conditions, and the education of Latinos in this country, as well as Filipino farm workers that exist to this day. Some of the Cesar Chavez work is still in place. And so I'm going to provide that for you outside of the video for Blackboard so that you have that there too. But in the interest of time, I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep moving, okay? Now, and another tool that you can use, right? Tools for wars we're talking about for social workers here are also treatment groups. It's important to understand that there are different types of treatment groups, particularly in these areas. Now, I'm not going to dive into too much of this today because you are actually going to build on your knowledge on some of these groups in other classes, particularly when we talk about your clinical training classes. You're going to receive information on therapy groups, support groups, right? Over the course of my career, I have run educational groups with kiddos. I've also run support groups and growth groups, as well as socialization groups, right? And outside of the notion of a clinical setting with kids. So just because you're a social worker doesn't mean you're never going to run groups, right? What's important to understand, though, is that all of the work that you're, oops, sorry about that. All of the work that you are doing as social workers, we need to approach it through the notion of what we call a critical friend, a critical friend. Now, some of you are saying, Dr. Mako, what the heck is a critical friend, right? And I'm going to explain that for you in a second. No matter what work you're doing, if you're choosing to do a social action group, if you're choosing to be on the board of directors, and I hope that many of you, choose to serve on a board of directors when that opportunity arises in your future. It's a little time consuming, but it's well worth it, knowing that you're creating a macro change for an organization. Whatever the interaction you're doing, if you're running treatment groups, right, or any of these, it's important to understand that you want to be a critical friend to those that you're serving. Here's what I mean. That as a critical friend, right? A critical friend can be defined as a trusted person who asks provocative questions, provides data to be examined through another lens, and offers critiques of a person's work as a friend. A critical friend takes the time to fully understand the context of the work presented and the outcomes that the person or group is working toward. The friend is an advocate for the success of that work. So I want you to hear this for a second. Some of us have friends that we know will back us no matter what. We have those friends that will nod their head and agree, and no matter what you say and how outlandish it is, they're going to say, I hear you, and you are right. And they're going to say that every single time, right? That's a good friend. They make you build you up. You feel good. You feel like you've been justified, right? That's not the definition, though, of a critical friend. A critical friend exists not only to tell you what you want to hear, but what you need to hear. Right? So some of us know that we have that friend we go to, and sometimes we may be thinking we're going to look for that support. We go to that friend and say, things are really tough. Here's what I did. And your friend's sitting there and they're quietly listening, right? And then your friend may say, can I share something with you? And you say yes, expecting to hear that you've been justified in your behavior. And that critical friend goes on to tell you how maybe you have missed the target, right? Misunderstood an incident, and you could have behaved differently to have improved that situation. That's the notion of a critical friend. As a social worker, our job isn't always to come in and tell people what they want to hear. Sometimes what's tough is we have to lead folks, right? Remember, red or blue pill, lead them to the red pill and say, can I share with you the reality of what I see happening? And I know this reality can be scary, and I know it can be uncomfortable, but I owe it to you because I care about you. I care about your community. I care about you all as a group. And I want you to really kind of take a look at what's happening here so that we can grow from it. That's a critical friend. So whatever group you're running, whatever group you're empowering, I'm sorry, this keeps moving forward on me. Whatever group you're running, whatever group you're empowering, right? Whatever you're leading as a social worker, whether that's a social action group, the board of directors, right? A treatment group. What's important to understand is you want to be a trusted member of the community viewed as having integrity, right? You are asking probing questions that make people think, right? And honestly may make people uncomfortable. Right. So you always know that the content that I bring you in our lectures may not always be comfortable. It'll be safe though, right? But it's in that moment when we're uncomfortable that we also find the greatest opportunity for transformation. That's our job as social workers, to make sure that people use data to help people see things through another lens. That's why I've taken all this time throughout these previous lectures to give you the data, right, of the distribution of wealth and power. It's tough for us to see, but now we understand the problem better. We understand it's not an individual problem, it's a systemic problem. And you have taken time to understand the unique context, right, of the district or the area that you're working. You're focused on outcomes, and you are committed to the success of the group to better meet the needs of individuals, right? So no matter what, and you're going to learn this in your, I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening with this, but there are 5 stages to group development, right? Forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Now, I'm not going to explain this to y'all today because it's been a long lecture. And on top of that, you are going to get this extensively in your clinical courses when you talk about running particularly therapy groups. But even if you're not running therapy groups, you're just running non-clinical groups, all of these stages will be present in your working with community members, okay? So these are just some, we'll leave these here. You can go through this as you move on. I'm actually gonna wrap up the lesson for today because that's been a lot of information. And I wanna leave you with something in particular, okay? I wanna leave you with a final reflection, one short video to ultimately understand what we're talking about. I hope that what you found was you're starting to see more tangible techniques and theoretical frameworks you can use. So to recap for this lesson, we addressed systems theory, we addressed empowerment theory, and we talked about what empowerment was. And then what I did was I also reminded you that we're committed to, when we're empowering folks, not only to empower those who have been hurt, but those who have done the hurting, right? And we've examined that from multiple perspectives. And then ultimately what I've said was, here are some examples of groups, right, that you will be using, techniques, types of groups that you will be running to empower individuals in the community. When we continue next week or the next lecture, I'll be giving you more tools you can use. But ultimately, we spent a lot of time in the head arena today, and I never want us to lose track of the heart of what's motivating us to do this work. I want to leave us with a final video from Maya Angelou, all right, that discusses the notion of love as a means of liberation. Ultimately, like we know in 1 Corinthians, that we can't do anything without love, right? If we do all of this work as social workers and we don't have love, they're just strategies. It's not transformation. So I want us to watch this final video. It's very short, from Maya Angelou, on what love is and how love liberates. All right, let me end this really quick, and we will end our lesson for today. This is just 2 minutes.
My grandmother, my father's mother, raised me. She was an amazing woman. She told me, sister, when you get, give. When you learn, teach. These are lessons to live by. I thought for a long time that my grandmother was God. She was so tall. And she used to tell me, sister, Mama don't know what she's going to do. Mama just going to step out on the word. Just step out on the word of God. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. People call me stupid, dumb, a moron, an idiot, because I didn't speak for 6 years. I was a mute. And Mama used to tell me when she'd braid my hair was huge and very curly. My mama would say, sister, Mama don't care what these people say, but you must be an idiot, you must be a moron, because you can't talk. Sister, Mama don't care. Mama know when you and the good Lord get ready, you're going to be a teacher. Sister, you're going to teach all over this world. I used to sit there and think, this poor ignorant woman, doesn't she know I will never speak? I've taught at the Bima Theater in Israel, in Tel Aviv. I've taught in Egypt. I've been distinguished visiting professor at the University of Exeter in England. I've taught in Rome and all over the United States. And each time I have another honor, I think of my grandma. So I am grateful to have been loved and to be loved now and to be able to love, because that liberates. Love liberates. It doesn't just hold. That's ego. Love liberates.
I just love Maya Angelou, don't you? Love liberates. Think about this notion, right? As social workers, there's going to be times where some of you might even be thinking this during this lesson. I'm throwing out all this theory and all of these different types of groups, and you're saying, can I do that? Am I in the right program? Am I in the right care? Can I see myself changing communities and families and agencies? Can I be on a board of directors and all that? If you're thinking that and you're doubting that, I would encourage you, don't doubt yourself. Yes, you can do it. Don't look at your faculty that when you look at our CVs, our curriculum vitae, or all of these things, and you say, oh, gosh, look at what they do. Like, can I ever be them? Yes, you can actually be them, because we were in your spot too at one point. What really is foundational to this, and I'd like us to remember that Maya Angelou shared with us, is love liberates, it doesn't hold. She said ego holds, right? And so when we're worried about if we can do something, when we're worried about if we can change a community, if we're worried that we can't run a group, that's our ego talking. That's the ego. That's not love. If we love our community so much that we don't want to see it oppressed, we're willing, even though scared, we're willing to step out and lead a discussion in our community against people that disagree, because we love our community that much. If we love our country so much that we won't want to see it eroded and giving way to things like racism and hate, if we love our country that much, then we're willing to stand up in opposition for these things, even if it feels scary, even if people threaten us, even if people threaten us with our health and well-being or with jail time or whatever the case is, because we love this country so much. If we love our clients so much that we don't want to see them, right, headed down a path where life is going to be worse for them based on decisions they make, if we love them that much, we're willing to tell them things that maybe are not comfortable for them to hear, but we know that they need to hear in that moment in order to hopefully inspire a little bit of change, right? Love liberates. Love liberates not only our communities, but it liberates ourselves from the fear that we may think we have of feeling like we can't do this work. So I just want you to be able to hear from me today, right? That is, as we move through these interventions, if it's creating anxiety in you or doubt that you can do these things in your career, no, like as Maya Angelou said, that's ego talking. Right? That's our mind saying to ourselves, right, that you can't do this. But we know that if we love, right, people enough, right, and we know that we want to break this social problem because we love people enough to know that they deserve lives of dignity and hope, right, then we can push past the fear and the doubt that we may be feeling and go on to do wonderful things in our career. Don't feel like you need to be an expert in this when you graduate. Remember, I'm giving you the overview of the materials so that you can use these and learn on these, expand on them later in your careers. Okay. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to close out with our centering activity today, right here. And our centering exercise for today will come from John chapter 8, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Right. So the truth of the matter is, God says, Jesus said, I love you no matter what. I love you so much that I'm going to lay down my life for you. I love you so much that I'm asking you to treat others the way you want to be treated. Right? You love yourself. You love me. You know I love you. Treat others with that same love. And when we can do that, the truth will set us free. So our word for today is going to be truth, right? And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Let's go ahead and make sure our hands and feet are in a nice, comfortable position. Let's go ahead and push out any of those doubts, those worries, those concerns, that anxiety you may feel as all this information is flying at you. Remember, the benefit to our asynchronous lessons is you can always rewind me later and say, what did he say about this, right? So you don't need to worry about that. Go ahead and take that nice deep breath. Allow Christ to kneel in your heart and pray, and speak truth right into your heart today. And I'll go ahead and keep track of the time. Okay, go ahead and take that nice deep breath. Open your eyes. Come on back. Folks, you are doing a fantastic job. I love the fact that you continue to persist. You are a fantastic group of students to have, right? I want to say thank you. I'm going to see you all later. Look, I can do the pose like in the, there you go. All right. I want to say that if you need anything from me, go ahead and shoot me an email. I'll be happy to respond. Also, please be sure to check Blackboard for your assignments and due dates like normal. And I will talk to you all soon. I hope you have a fantastic week. I'll see you all later. Thank you very much.